Tickets. Tickets, please.
Your soul.
Step inside. Take a ride upon the Terror Train. All aboard, be fair warned. These rails house fear and pain. Find a seat. Don't mind the heat. Just pray the lights stay on. Upon these rails, these bloody rails, in darkness lies no dawn. Yes, step inside. Come crawl or glide. With us you shall remain. Upon this ride, this hellish ride, we call the Terror Train. Ticket, please. James Ward Kirk Publications presents Terror Train. Episode 115, Texas.
Welcome aboard. Welcome to my home. I am the disembodied voice, your ghost host, so to speak. Call me Terror. Welcome to my train. Be you dead, undead, or of the living. Tonight, for have crawled aboard our train of terror. Ooh, I like that. Yes, 4, and the door shut permanently behind them. First passenger on this horror-filled evening is Shenoa Carroll-Bradd. Her story involves a lover's quarrel and a ghostly train. Oh, how romantic the dead can be, don't you think? Wanna give it a try? A bloody ticket is handed to our conductor, which reads Shenoa Carroll-Bradd. Live tracks.
Ticket, please. Live Tracks by Shenoa Carroll-Bradd. I still hear the train whistle at night, even though the lines don't run through town anymore. I hear it most often at the edges of sleep, wailing through the dark and piercing the night, making sure I never forget, as if I could. Some nights I tumble out of bed and dash onto the street to see if I can still catch it. Part of me feels, not thinks or prays, but feels, in the way of phantom limbs, that if I could just make it outside in time, I'll see the train. And once the engine can be seen, the engine can be stopped. I have to try. I'm getting faster, but no matter how quickly I sprint, I always seem to miss it. Sometimes I can still smell it on the air, metal, oil, and gross machine heat, reminding me of the night you left. The engine of your crappy Kia choking to life after our shouting match, the squeal of tires as you pulled away, and me plunging through the door to face an empty street, the lingering stink of your leaky transmission warm as breath on my face. I was going to surprise you with a new engine after graduation, one that wouldn't shudder or balk, but now it sits under a tarp in the garage, like a kid hiding from the boogeyman. The tracks stay quiet through the day, slowly sinking under a froth of weeds and litter, but I've spotted children harvesting warped coins off the rails. If no trains run through town anymore, what flattens the pennies? Your mother used to hear it too. I know she did. The train whistle crying its alarm, underscored by the thunderous impact as it hits your stalled car over and over, again and again, night after night. I tried to ask her about it, but she refused to talk about the train or the accident. Then, after a while, she refused to talk about anything. She's gone now, fled somewhere without tracks, far away and out of earshot. But I hear it, baby, and I keep trying to catch it. I couldn't stop her from leaving, just as I couldn't stop you from driving away that night. Just as I can't stop the train from screaming now. What bothers me the most is not that I'm being haunted. I can live with that, if you'll pardon the pun. What bothers me is that the train came back, but you didn't. I've kept your room the same, just in case. And there's still a row of your energy drinks waiting, unopened, in the fridge. If I have to wait, I'll wait. And if I have to keep chasing the train, that's what I'll do.
Two poets have boarded tonight's track. Seems familiar, these two men of the melodic macabre. The cadence is deadly. Their poem narrates a story of a circus train. No cotton candy dreams here. Oh no, here lies nightmares. And terror gives you fair warning. This recording contains calliope music. Their bloody ticket reads Stephen Alexander and Roger Cowin. Circus Train.
Ticket, please. Circus Train by Stephen Alexander and Roger Cowin. The circus train rolls toward your town to set up tents of wonders and delights. For the price of admission, you can see grinning clowns in whiteface, packed inside their psychedelic clown cars, live acrobats dangling precariously from wires, long-legged lovelies riding high-stepping elephants, and trained tigers jumping through hoops of fire. For just a few dollars more, you can pass through the door and dance with the three-legged tap dancer, rub cheeks with the bearded lady, or take a ride on the goat boy's back. And, for the mere price of a dream, this circus can make you scream. With bloody beheadings, bodies swinging from hooks like grotesque pendulums, innocents burned alive by devil-faced fire-breathers, and pin-headed geeks feasting on human flesh. It's all up to you. Just choose your delight. From fantasy to nightmare, pleasure to pain, you can find it all today, arriving on the Circus Train.
From Texas, our final passenger is trapped helplessly aboard. Oh, yes, kicking and screaming, of course. A hellish tale in exchange for his mortal soul. Involves a train where mutilation runs rampant, and an Englishman is not quite what he appears to be. Oh, those bloody Englishmen! our conductor. It reads A.P. Gilbert, the Meat Wagon.
Ticket, please. The Meat Wagon by A.P. Gilbert. It was known by some as the Cuntmobile, by others the Fuck Wagon. It was what it was, a whorehouse on dusty rails of iron. Only 2 stops, 300 miles between. 300 miles of blood, semen, and good old-fashioned screams. Screams of pleasure, or screams of pain, depending on the desires of the clientele. Everything was catered, and anyone was welcome, so long as they had the silver to pay. 5 men stood at the station when the meat wagon pulled in, with a rush of sickly scented smoke, and a cry of reluctant brakes. They paid their coin to the black man when he stepped from the engine bay. They chose their meat with fingers pointing silently through carriage windows at painted whores with fearful eyes. These 5 iniquitous men had sick thoughts in their minds and erections in their dirty pants. A 6th man stepped aboard the final carriage as the train began to move. He turned and pulled the silver timepiece from a pocket in his immaculate black frock coat. He looked at the initials R.F. inscribed into the back and smiled. The black man shoveled another pile of coal into the firebox and watched as the flames licked harshly between the black rocks. 10 long years he had been shoveling from that same pile of coal into that same hellish pit, never relighting it, never restocking the fuel. He couldn't remember his life before the train, not even his name, but he remembered with clarity every day since. He could picture the dead faces of 1,000 nameless women whom he had thrown from this iron monster to be devoured by the coyotes and the crows. He scratched with chapped fingers at the black metal mask that covered his face. How he longed to remove his shroud. How he longed to touch the skin of his face again. 10 long years of service, and his time was nearly up. The black man had paid his dues, but for what? He wasn't aware. All he knew was that he would be there soon. Grace Edgley looked at the man in front of her, his hard prick sticking out of his dirty yellow underpants in an unwavering salute. "Didn't you hear me, bitch?" he spat. She'd heard him. He tugged at his ragged black beard as he kicked one leg from the brown pants lying at his ankles. In the years she'd been traveling inside this roaming locomotive, she'd not heard a demand of this nature. He had asked for a child. He walked across the room to her, small puffs of sawdust lifting from the floor at each step, his cock bouncing in front of him as if on its own volition. She licked her lips and found her voice. "Wouldn't you rather let me—" He cut her off with a raised hand and stepped to within an inch from her nose. She felt his hot, pungent breath touch her lips. He grabbed her hair, tied up in a neat plait, and turned away, dragging her backward. She grasped at his hand as her feet kicked along the floor, but he was large and his grip strong. Grace found herself flung face first onto the bed beside the window. He straddled her naked back, pulling her head backwards with his left hand on her forehead. She struggled to breathe, trying to move around, attempting to shift his weight. He released her forehead, then struck her in the side of the face with a huge fist. Grace screamed out and felt heat spread across from her ear and down her neck. He avoided her flailing punches and twisted her arm up so that her hand was between her shoulder blades. She tensed, but kept quiet. He leaned forward and whispered into Grace's ear. She felt the wiry hair of his beard against her cheek. "You will do as I fucking say." She could barely hear him over the ringing in her ear. "Okay," she answered softly. After a few moments, he released her and stood. She waited until he had stepped away from her bare body before twisting and propping herself up on her elbows. He leered at her big breasts as she stood, and he smiled at her with a sideways grin, half full of blackened teeth. She scowled before walking past him out of her suite, into the corridor. The black man flicked off the monitor to Suite 3. The name Gerald Death stayed lit at the bottom for a second or two before blinking out of sight. The black man had often wondered how the train knew who was in each suite. Wondered, but never discovered. Not that this was the only puzzling occurrence on a train so full of mystery. He looked at the surveillance screens that constantly recorded the corridors running down the right side of the train. He thought he saw something in the rear carriage and zoomed in, using a small black knob beneath a line of flashing lights. Only a heat shimmer, nothing solid. He flicked on the monitor to Suite 7. The name Billy Flack scrolled the width of the screen before the view to the room's interior became clear. Billy moaned again as he reached completion. The red-haired woman kneeled down below his waist, holding him between her lips, moving back and forth. He enjoyed watching it. Billy had been reluctant to come here at first, but his pa had insisted. He had even paid for it. A 16th birthday gift. Billy was still a virgin. The boy bucked against her, clutching at the back of her head as he released his seed into her mouth with a cry. He lifted his hands. She moved slowly backwards and let his softening cock fall from her mouth before looking into his face with sultry eyes and smiling lips. Billy leaned back against the hard wooden wall, peering from the window at the barren landscape rocketing past. He listened to the clackety-clackety-clackety-clack of the wheels against the rails. The noise vibrated through his body, and he felt his erection return. "What the fuck do you think I am?" Gerald asked again. "You asked for a child," Grace said, a smile touching the corner of her mouth. She had returned to the suite cradling a baby under a year old. The child lay, eyes almost closed, wrapped in a soft wool blanket, cooing gently. The children of the working women, for there is a surety that children will be born on a train such as this, lived in a carriage at the rear. The girls groomed for their time aboard the Iron Beast. The boys forgotten the moment they left the comfort of the womb. Grace looked down at the child. She knew that she would never let this man take her. "Do you really think you're in a position to mock me?" the man said with a snarl as he slid the small window behind him back on its runners. His voice softened. Sand and sawdust formed a vortex in the corner of the room. His long hair blew in front of his face. "Bring me the child." He held his arms out to her. Grace looked at the baby, then to him, then past him to the open window. "No," she said. "If I have to come to you, I'll cut your tits off before we're done." Voice cracking, the calming tone gone. Grace didn't answer, but just cast her eyes back down at the innocent face of the baby. "Let's hope this works," she thought. "I've had enough of this shit," Gerald said as he strode towards the naked woman and the child. "Give me that thing." He reached out to grab the baby, but Grace turned to her right. The bearded man grasped Grace's arm and whipped her back around. Grace unsheathed the short blade from its scabbard beneath the infant's wrap and swung it in an arc to slice into the stomach of the man. She felt the knife tear, deep and long, through sun-baked skin. The man fell to his knees, arms wide, his face etched with disbelief. "What the hell did you just do?" He tried to stand, but his foot slipped in the mess which had spilled from the hole in his belly. He slipped sideways, and his foot dragged more guts from the wound. It was a bloody tug-of-war. Gerald's head hit the wall, and his eyes rolled back in their sockets. Only the whites showed. Grace turned and put the baby on the soft bedroll. When she turned back, the man had roused. Although he still lay on his side, he began to pull at his soft innards, trying to pack them back into his blood-drenched belly. "I'm going to fucking kill you," he said. "I'm going to fucking kill you." Grace sat down next to the baby and stroked her hair until the child had settled and her eyes closed. She reached under the bed and pulled out her brown, knee-length stiletto boots. She watched his frantic efforts as she carefully laced them up, then stood and stepped forward. The black man had seen that shimmer again move slowly up the train, while Grace Edgley performed her severe act of redemption. He knew what it was. Rather, he knew who it was. He knew him as Raymond Fogg. The monitor to Suite 11 flickered on, and he turned to watch. "So what will your pleasure be, handsome?" Her voice was sweet and sexy with a southern twang. The man in front of her was tall and surprisingly good-looking. He had a 2-day stubble on his cheeks and a cigarette at the corner of his mouth. "What's yours?" he asked. Matilda walked across the floor towards him as she unbuttoned her low-cut blouse. She opened it up, revealing her firm white breasts, accented by tiny pink nipples. He reached out and took one between his finger and thumb, pinching it. She moaned, "Harder. I like it hard." "I hoped you'd say that." The good-looking man seized her throat, spat his cigarette to the ground, and bit down onto the top of her breast. Matilda tried to pull away, but he had his arm around her waist. She smacked her fists against his shoulders, and then at his head. He released his bite and lifted his head before thrusting it forwards, plowing it into the woman's face. She fell to the floor, and her head struck the corner of the bed. Matilda moaned as he pulled her viciously onto her back. Her small breasts shook gently. Blood seeped from the wound just below her collarbone and stained one side of her white blouse. She tried to turn her head. Gray filled her world. Her strength drained along with the color. Cold steel touched her skin. She tasted copper at the back of her throat. The cowboy turned Matilda's face to his. He kissed her deeply as he moved his weapon up her long white leg. It reached her thigh, and rough hands pulled her legs apart. She couldn't oppose it. The whore was dry, resisting the barrel of his Colt SAA. He spat and pushed harder until her hole yielded, and it let it painfully in. Matilda let out a small cry, but she didn't move away. He smiled as he watched until the pistol was in up to his trigger finger. He cocked the hammer with one split-nailed thumb. Raymond Fogg was the gentleman in the black frock coat, and known by many names: Roy Frith, Richard Fairweather, Ralph Faust, among others. He watched the children play in the unlit wagon at the rear of his train. He smiled as their mothers, aunts, grandmothers, the unchosen whores, held them lovingly. They saw him watching and cowered away from his smiling face. He chuckled, a deep, inhuman sound, as he raised one hand to his brow in a salute, before adjusting his gold cufflinks, tightening his cravat, and turning away. Gerald had just managed to push his guts back into his swollen, distended belly when Grace's heel stamped down on his naked penis with such force that his scrotum split, one testicle spilling out to hang from a thick, bloody rope. The man retched and drew his knees up, opening the gash across his stomach. His guts spilled out again with a gush of blackening blood. He tried to breathe, but all he produced was a thin whine. "You're not looking too hot, mister." Grace bit down gently, seductively, on the top of her tongue, and raised one eyebrow. "I think your child-fucking days are over." He looked at her with wet eyes and a fury more extreme than any he had felt before. He wanted to speak, wanted to tell her that he was going to shove her little knife so far up her disease-filled cunt that it would graze the back of her throat. He wanted to speak, but he couldn't. The pain in his cock and the ache in his belly had linked arms and become best of friends. The pain was so huge that he was struggling to breathe. Grace lifted her foot again and rested the point of the heel on the surface of one open eye. Gerald's arms slapped uselessly at her calves. The eye blinked reflexively, but was unable to close as she continued to apply pressure. Even after these 10 years, the black man had not become accustomed to the depravity aboard the train, and was sickened by the abilities of humankind. He closed his eyes beneath his mask and breathed deeply. He was so tired, but he still had a job to do. The monitor for Suite 13 flickered on. "And that's why everyone in Arizona knows the name of William Stryker." Eleanor fought against her yawn as he concluded his tale. "So, we gonna fuck?" She lay impatiently on her bed. It was the first time she had wanted a client to get a buck up. She was getting bored, and if she didn't get him moving, the black man would be upset. Yep, I'm getting there." He was an old boy, looked like a retired gold prospector. Long gray beard and hair tied up in a loose, greasy ponytail at the back of his head. Eleanor was at least 30 years his junior. Her firm breasts and a purple, uplifting corset showed her trim belly and sleek shoulders. She stood from the bed and walked to the chair where Stryker sat. She reached out and stroked his bearded cheek. "I'm not one for waiting." She unlaced one side of her corset and started on the other. "Now, why don't you help a gal out and slip those big, heavy boots off?" He bent down with a struggle never taking his eyes from the dark-skinned breasts, which had been released from their silky prison. He fingered his bootlaces. Eleanor reached behind her head and pulled the stick which held her hair at the top of her head in a neat bun. Her hair spilled down like a silky black waterfall, and Randolph's breath caught in his throat. He returned to his laces with a renewed fervor. The woman with the coffee-colored skin took his hand and pulled him up. He put one hand on the arm of the chair to help his progress. He was shorter than her. It ceased to matter when she crouched down. She unbuttoned his pants, and they dropped to the floor to reveal a gray-haired, semi-erect penis. She breathed through her mouth and tried hard not to show her disgust. She stood again and led Randolph over to the bed, where he lay on his back. She wasted no more time as she bent and slid her knickerbockers to her ankles to reveal her hairless sex. The old man licked his lips and reached out a hand to touch the folds of skin between her legs. Eleanor climbed on top of the man. His cock stood proud. She spat on her hand and rubbed it between her legs, leaving it shimmering and wet. She lowered herself down slowly, until he was in her all the way. She moved herself up and down, her hands against his thighs, until he closed his eyes and panted. She kept him deep and rocked backwards and forwards. She was surprised at the moistness of her twat. His panting quickened. She closed her eyes and leaned her head back. His cock pulsated with an imminent ejaculation, and Eleanor tightened her pelvic muscles to draw his orgasm out. He tensed, and she opened her eyes. He stared back, eyes wide, hands clutched across his chest. She felt him shoot his semen deep inside her, and watched his face go blank. She stopped moving, and his hands released each other and flopped to their sides. His eyes stared up at her, unseeing, dead. Eleanor shrugged and started to move again, leaning back against the dead man's thighs as she rode him to her own end. The black man looked away from the monitor at a knock on his door. Rat-a-tat-tat. It was barely noticeable over the clack-a-clack-clack of the locomotive's drive, but the black man always knew when his cab was touched. He looked to his left. There was a narrow doorway which led to a corridor attached to the outer edge of the tender. He reached down to the hand wheel on the solid door and turned it. The door opened outwards, and he, turning sideways, stepped onto the windy gangway. A large man stood in front of him, just inside the foremost carriage, at a door to the first suite. The black man gazed at him through his unmoving mask. The head of the train's tallest client was slightly bent down, so as not to touch the ceiling. He had a shotgun shell necklace which hung over his hairless chest to his heavily muscled stomach. The black man pulled a notebook from the front pocket of his dark blue overalls and ran a finger down the inked list he had made from the names on the monitors. He looked up again at the cowboy as he found his name, Manford Burks. Manford moved aside as the black man peered past him at the blood-soaked slab of meat in the corner of Suite 33. There were no obvious features of it ever being remotely human. Maybe, he thought, he could avoid having to look at another set of cold, dead eyes. "I want another woman brought to my room," the man said, in a huge Texan voice that was easily heard over the rushing air from the open door. The black man turned his head upwards and pointed at a plaque nailed straight on the frame above the door. Manford began to read. "No, Oh, fuck this, he said. I don't read. Who the fuck reads? The black man looked straight into Manfred's eyes and began to speak. His voice was slow, breathless, and painfully raw, like a razor blade cutting through stone. The large man shook visibly as the sound etched its way beneath the mask. No refunds, he said. No exchanges. No arguments. Any complaints must be made in writing to me, the black man said, lengthening me until it began to sound like a scream. But how can I expect someone as plainly stupid as Manfred Berks to write anything apart from his own name? Manfred struck without warning, a huge fist aimed at the black man's head. The masked man stepped backward and raised his own fist to meet the Texan's. The two hands connected, and, although the driver's hand was dwarfed, it was the bones of the cowboys that shattered. Manfred screamed and clutched his hand with his other shovel-sized limb. Look what the fuck you done, you little freak! But the black man didn't look. He turned away, unperturbed. Manfred ran at him. As he reached the open door to the gangway, the black man turned and seized the cowboy's throat. His fingers dug in around the man's trachea. Manfred slapped at him, trying to break his hold, but the black man did not falter. With ease, he lifted the heavily muscled man off his feet. Twisting, the black man slammed Manfred against the ground in the doorway to his corridor. The black man stepped over him and took hold of the hand wheel. He pulled the door against the fallen man's cheek. Manfred got his hand up and held onto the rim. It made no difference. The black man continued to pull and watched as the metal door began to draw blood across the man's face. The crack of Manfred Berks' jaw was audible even that close to the driving wheel and pistons. The man tried to cry out. As he released the tension of his clenched teeth, the door moved quicker, ripping his cheek up to the ear, taking with it a number of rear teeth. The black man saw the Texan had lost consciousness, but continued to pull, until the top half of his head rolled inside. It looked like a snack bowl on the floor. The door latch closed. Don't you think you should stop that, my dear? Grace turned at the voice of the well-spoken Englishman who stood in the doorway to her suite. In her shock, she almost let her heel slip deeper into the gutted man's eye socket. She removed her foot from the lightly breathing blind man and stood up straight. She opened her mouth to speak. Nothing came out. Oh, don't worry, my sweet. I often have that effect. People seem to lose their nerve around me. His voice, though soft and gentle, demanded complete submission. Now, do you really think we should do that to one of our clients? Grace shook her head slowly. She gazed into the blue eyes of the man standing before her and watched them change to brown and then to green. His face changed constantly, yet remained the same. He was beautiful. Why don't you take a walk with me, Grace? He took her hand. He helped her to step over the man and put his hand onto one bare buttock as they walked outside. She glanced backwards at the bed where she had laid the sleeping baby, but the child was gone, and soon enough Grace's memory of her had disappeared too. She walked alongside the gentleman, but she felt as if she were floating
Her limbs were not her own, yet she still felt many cold hands touching her skin. Cold hands that belonged to Raymond Fogg. She closed her eyes and let him lead her. Billy looked up from between the girl's legs at the man standing in the doorway to his suite. The girl, Mabel Boyd, lay naked, hands wrapped in knotted red hair, a moan of pleasure caught in her closed throat. Neither of them spoke against the unexpected interruption. "Oh, this just won't do," wailed Grace. He didn't wait for an answer, nor did he get one. "I can't have this going on in my train today." He waved a finger between the two naked people in front of him. "Today is a very important day." They all looked at him, silent, unable to move. "Oh dear," he said in that soft and friendly voice. "How did you think this would pan out? Pay your coin and take your woman when you leave? That isn't the kind of establishment I'm running here." He chuckled softly. "My train isn't the kind of place where that happens." He walked over and sat down on the bed next to Mabel's head. He stroked her hair gently. "I am sorry, my dear. You see, today we've had a change in destination, and they're rather strict at the next station. Only one person per room." I know, he said, though no one had commented. "It's a strange rule, but I'm not the one that made it up." He chuckled again. "I don't like to be the bearer of bad news, but I'm afraid only one of you can leave this room. I'll leave it to you to decide who." Billy and Mabel looked towards each other as the suited man stood and walked away. The door closed, and the silence was broken. Grace followed Fogg through the narrow corridors, past suite doors both open and closed. They passed from one carriage to another, and then into a third. As they reached the first suite, a shot rang out, and a hole appeared in the wall beside Fogg's head. He turned to face the hole, and Grace saw the wound in the side of his face. One eye hung from a bloody socket. He grinned. "Ah, splendid." He opened the door. Matilda's face had been mutilated. Skin peeled away from bone. Her tongue lolled around in a cavernous mouth filled with broken teeth and saliva-diluted blood. A gaping hole filled most of her lower stomach, where her insides had been turned into a bubbling mess of blood and bile. Black burns lined the lips of her vulva. The skin had blistered and burnt. "Splendid," Fogg said again, as he looked over at the man standing silently in the corner. "I really wish I could stay and observe, Mr. Compton, but, alas, I have other business today." Elmer Compton nodded. "Please, continue." Fogg turned back to the door, and Grace saw his face had returned to its former beauty. The black man waited in his sooty cab as Fogg walked down the narrow corridor beside the tent. "It has been 10 years, he said, stepping through the doorway. The black man saw him for who he truly was and backed away. "You are free to go." Fogg's voice was like pulled testicles and ripping nails. "Unless, my friend, you would like to stay." The black man shook his head. Fogg took the black mask in his manicured hand. It slipped off with ease, and the black man felt air against his skin. "What is my name?" The first question that came to mind. "You'll find out," he said, "in time." Then the black man disappeared. Grace pulled at the arm of the eyeless cowboy as she dragged him through the dark corridors outside the locomotive's tender. This is what he had requested, so she had returned to her suite to do his bidding. "Thank you, my dear." A genuine-looking smile. "I will join you shortly." Grace turned and walked back outside. She was still naked. Even in the cold air, her body dripped with sweat. She looked at the bloody trail from the body she had destroyed. Touching herself, she smiled. Gerald was still alive. Somehow. His guts had spilled from his belly again. "How would you like to live, my friend?" Fogg asked. The cowboy nodded once and vomited onto his chest. "I'm very glad. Do you have a pen?" "No." "Oh, well, I'm sure we can think of something." Fogg pulled a folded sheet from the inside pocket of his black suit jacket and spread it in front of the cowboy. He reached down, pulled a fat coil of intestines to his mouth. He bit into it. Thick black fluid ran down his chin and onto the white collar of his suit. He took the cowboy's finger and dipped it into the gurgling tube and guided it to the bottom of the sheet. "Sign here, my friend," he said. Grace turned as Fogg appeared behind her. The heat had intensified. She looked out across the barren landscape to the horizon. Reds, yellows, and oranges swam across the skies. Rocky outcrops grew in places which had been flat moments before. Swirling purple clouds burst into being. "I'm glad we could be here together, my dear." Fogg spoke to her, but looked into the distance. "It is a pleasure to have such beautiful company." He stroked her bare shoulder. She smiled and reached down to unbutton his pants. "You'll enjoy this, my dear," he said. She nodded as his pants opened, but when she saw the size of the thing Fogg had for her, she began to scream. He didn't even recognize his hands. He looked around, but there was nothing to jog his memory. 2 iron rails running across endless sand. He reached down and touched one of the rails. It was cold, even in the bright heat of the sun. He blinked at the sensation, at the coldness. He remembered his face, hard, cold like ice, a black metal mask. Then it was gone. He squinted at the sun. He needed to move. He would die out here in the desert. He stepped between the tracks and began to walk.
Yes, our guests have taken their permanent seats. From New York to time infinite. Are you ready to join them? Perhaps another story will lure you. Choose a car, any car, for the time we had a permanent guest. As they tell their tales of horror at its best. Come, yes, join me. My name is Terror, who rides the rails eternally upon the Terror Train.
Survived this trek? No turning back. Dare resist, just try. Step back inside, we'll be your guide. So many ways to die. Upon this ride, nowhere to hide. With us, you shall remain. Upon this ride, this hellish ride, we call the Terror Train.
Terror Train Podcast, Episode 115, Texas. Produced by Krista Clark-Grabowski, David Schutz II, and Mary Genevieve Fortier. Podcast directed and arranged by David Schutz II. The conductor, your narrator, was created by and played by David Schutz II. Terror, the disembodied voice, was created by and played by Mary Genevieve Fortier. Terror Train Podcast opening and closing poems written by Mary Genevieve Fortier. Host segment dialogue for Terror, the Disembodied Voice, written by Mary Genevieve Fortier. Production music, The House of Leaves, Chase Pulse, The Hive, and The Voices by Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com. Featured works, Live Tracks, written by Shenoa Carroll-Bradd. Production music, Echoes of Time, version 2, by Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com. Circus Train, written by Stephen Alexander and Roger Cowin. Production music, Come Play With Me, by Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com. Circus Calliope, by Audiosparks.com. The Meat Wagon, written by A.P. Gilbert. Production music, Night of Chaos, Satiate, Only Strings. Evening of Chaos, Ghost Story, Measured Paces, Echoes of Time, version 2, Controlled Chaos, No Percussion, Gathering Darkness, Controlled Chaos, Decay, Unseen Horrors, Classic Horror 3, and Bent and Broken by Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com. Additional sound effects by AudioSoundClips.com. Podcast program edited by David Schutz II. The stories and poems presented in the Terror Train podcasts are all featured in the James Ward Kirk Publishing Anthology, Terror Train, which was edited by Krista Clark-Grabowski and A. Henry Keene. Cover art by Stephen Cooney. Content copyright 2014. Terror Train, podcast episode 115, Texas. Copyright 2014.